Well, a warm welcome this morning to everybody who has tuned in to this webinar, which is the third in the series of the 5 conversations. So welcome. This is the conversation on opportunities for growth. And we had a really good couple of sessions yesterday on the group coaching, and generally speaking, the feedback has been very positive. About the 5 conversations, and that's great. I know some people are having some challenges with it, but that's to be expected. But generally speaking, the feedback has been very good, and the truth is that each of these conversations gets easier and easier the further we go through the process. So welcome to everyone, and this short, sharp webinar, which of course will be recorded or is being recorded, and we've also got the slides here that we will put up in the portal once we've completed it, so you can review it and discuss it as well as listen in this morning. So if you've got questions, if you've got comments, if you've got observations, if you've got feedback, I'm more than happy to hear that. And if you just go over to the question box and just type in your questions, I'll stop the broadcast and respond to those questions as we get to them. All right, so let's get underway. There's basically 3 things that I do want to cover in this short session of 30 minutes. I want to just quickly review the 5 conversations framework and understand what's entailed in the framework, where we are in the process. As you're aware now, we're in conversation 3, and at this stage, you should have completed your strengths and talents conversation and your climate review conversation. And I suggest if you haven't got there, then I would do that as soon as possible, because we want to keep everybody on track. You might be aware, of course, that we had a survey at the beginning of this, and that those survey results, by the way, are available on the ShareSource site. And what we're hoping to do, of course, is to run those survey results again at the end of the 5 conversations, and that will give us a clear picture of a before and after snapshot to determine whether or not we've been effective in the process and whether it's made a difference in a number of areas that people have made comment about. So we will then look at, obviously, the conversation that I'm really referring to today, which of course is the opportunities for growth conversation. And I'll cover the questions in there and talk a little bit about the purpose of the conversation. And then what I'll do is I will perhaps finish with some tips and hints that will assist you to improve the quality of the conversation. I'm mindful of the fact that people could be watching this video or broadcast and be either a person administering the conversations or a person on the receiving end of the conversations, or most likely both. So I'll talk about both dimensions as we go through the broadcast this morning. All right, so once again, I just want to reiterate the purpose of the 5 conversations framework, and I think that we have there's some clarity now from some of the feedback from yesterday's group coaching sessions that people are pretty much aware of what we're trying to do. But let me just remind people, and if you are on the receiving end of a conversation, this is the reason, this is the rationale, the purpose of the 5 conversations. And of course, if you are somebody who is conducting these conversations, here is the rationale or the purpose for the 5 conversations. So of course you can mention that in your presentations. So the purpose is to develop a higher level of trust throughout the organisation. It's to create some synergy, and what I mean by that is that people are on the same page, and we have some clarity around expectations and so forth. And thirdly, it's about developing ways and means of assisting people to excel in their work. So really there are 3 avenues for that. This is not to be confused with a performance review. This is not a performance review, and it's wrong to see it clothed up as a performance review. It's a series of developmental conversations to assist people to be effective in their jobs. Okay, so let's move on. Now, the purpose of the opportunities for growth conversation is twofold. Now, by the name of the conversation, it probably gives it away a little bit as to what it is, but the purpose is to identify one or two areas of improvement. Now, any more than two, and it's too much, it's overwhelming, and one is fine, but you may want to cover two areas in your conversation, and that's okay, but I would suggest that you don't cover any more than two because these conversations are supposed to be relatively short, and we're all busy people. So, and of course, if we get to another round of the 5 conversations, something else can be discussed as an area for improvement in the opportunities for growth conversation in round 2. So that's important. And the other important purpose of the conversation is to consider how the person can be supported to make those improvements. So, it might not be apparent during the conversation, but certainly the emphasis is to help the person to make those improvements. And some of those things are fairly obvious, things that you might be able to do if you're a leader, but in other cases they may not be. But nevertheless, if you know what those areas of improvement are, you're in a position where you can perhaps, give some advice in terms of how that might be dealt with. Bearing in mind the next conversation is the learning and development conversation. And during that conversation, of course, you've got an opportunity, of course, to discuss some of the key ways and means of being able to address some of the strengths and talents discussed in conversation 2. And also perhaps ways and means of being able to overcome some of the opportunities for growth in conversation 3. So that's essentially the purpose, and it's good to keep those in mind when you have that conversation. And if you're a leader, you may well want to reinforce the purpose of this conversation up front. It's certainly not a problem to do that. In fact, in many ways, it's a good idea to do that, to simply make a comment such as, I'm really interested in one, perhaps even two areas that you see growth in, and if I can assist, I'd like to be able to do that. That's what the purpose of this conversation is. That's the way I might want to start this conversation, just to be outlining what the purpose of the conversation is. All right. Now, you've all seen this slide at some point somewhere, I'm sure, and I just want to reiterate where we're up to. And you can see that there are 5 conversations in the framework, hence the 5 conversations framework. And you can see now that we're up to the conversation 3, which is opportunities for growth. And I had a little bit of feedback yesterday in the group coaching sessions that some of the conversations last longer than others, and that's understandable. The first conversation, for example, might have lasted a little longer because there were a lot of issues that were perhaps discussed, whereas I would imagine in conversation 2, it probably wouldn't have gone for more than 20 minutes. It needn't have gone more than 20 minutes. So this conversation perhaps needn't go for more than 20 minutes either. I would suspect that conversation 4 will be reasonably short because this is about learning and development opportunities. And in conversation 5, which is innovation and continuous improvement, you're expected to come to that conversation with some ideas about how to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the workplace that you're working in. And some of those issues may require a little bit more time. So I suspect that conversation 5 may be a little longer. But roughly, the whole process is designed to have 5 20-minute conversations, and that's the purpose. So that's the framework, that's where we're up to, and we're making some good progress. And as I said earlier, we're getting some really good feedback, and that's always encouraging to continue that process. Okay, and of course, if you've got any questions, just type them into the question box there on the right-hand side as we go, and I'll be more than happy to answer those. Now, the key from this morning's session is the questions that relate to the opportunities and growth conversation, and I've got them up there on your screen. So let's run through them, and I'll talk a little bit about each one, perhaps why you need to ask these questions and what you might do in terms of preparing for these questions, knowing full well that they'll be asked of you in the conversation. So, of course, like all of these things, we're not expecting you to read them off, but we've just given you some templates to work with. So question one might be around, you've no doubt had a chance to review your current role. If there is one area that you believe that you have an opportunity for growth, what would it be? Now, the whole purpose of asking that question, now, if you're a leader, you may say, well, I know what those opportunities for growth are, but that's not the point. The point is for the person on the receiving end of the conversation to volunteer one area of growth. So in other words, they need to have given it some thought. So before you come to this conversation, I want you to think carefully, what is one area of growth for me? And this is not just, some sort of a weakness or whatever. It's just an area that you believe that you would like to build your skill sets up in. So give that some thought, because the whole purpose of that is for you to be able to respond to that question with at least one area. Now, once you've mentioned whatever it is that you believe is an area for growth, the next question is, can you elaborate on this so that I understand what you mean? Because it may not become apparent or obvious why that's an area of growth or even what you mean by that. So be prepared, if you're on the receiving end of this conversation, to be able to elaborate a little bit on that. Now, how do you do that? Well, the best way to do that is to use critical incidents or examples, talk about work projects, talk about things that have been done recently so that the leader can get a handle on what it is that you see as an area of growth. So be prepared to elaborate and give some examples, and that should be discussed. And once you've done that, of course, the next question that the leader will ask you, if you're on the receiving end, and if you're the leader, you'd ask this, what can we do to improve this performance? Now, you notice that there's a we word in there, and the reason that we've got that in there is that whilst there might be some responsibility on the person coming to the conversation to perhaps improve in that area, the reality is it might need the support of the leader. So that's why we say we. So really the intent is there for the leader to provide or offer opportunities wherever possible, of course, for growth. Now, it might not become apparent what that is. Again, if it's not apparent, then discuss it. Talk about it. What are some ways we might be able to improve this performance, which is essentially what the question's about. And just spend a bit of time on that, because at the end of the day, it's one thing identifying an area for improvement. It's another thing to identify some ways that we might go about improving that. So it's important that we discuss that. Now, apart from that, what other areas in your current role do you think is an opportunity for growth? So this question offers the person coming to the conversation with an opportunity to mention another area. Now, if you spend a fair bit of time and it's very clear what the opportunity for growth area is in the third question, then perhaps you may not need to go there. But certainly if the first opportunity for growth is fairly obvious and there's something that can be done about it and needs to be done and we've agreed on what we can do, then you can launch into a second opportunity or area for growth. So that's the purpose of that question. But as I said earlier, you don't want to be covering a lot of things in this conversation, because by covering several things, what happens is you dilute them all and it's remember the whole process is that ultimately you'd be going through another cycle of the 5 conversations and you could discuss another area at another date. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. Now you'll notice that the last 3 questions are in brackets, and these are questions that may not, or well, they're not, one of them is not a question, but they may not need to be discussed in this conversation. But as a leader, I put them in there because you might find that what somebody else has said is not necessarily consistent with your own view of what that opportunity for growth is, in which case you can quite easily volunteer and say, can I suggest another area that you might consider? So, you know, there might be an area that you want to discuss with the other person that hasn't been discussed, but you can have that up your sleeve if need be to put on the table. And once you've put that on the table, and what I suggest you do when you do put that on the table, if you need to put it on the table, is to give an example or a critical incident or a little bit of an elaboration, because you don't want the other person to say, I don't know what you mean, or what are you talking about, or when did that happen, or what's that all about. So the whole idea is for you to be very clear about that. So as the leader, one of the things that you might prepare for in this conversation to have up your sleeve is an area for improvement that you've identified, you've observed. Now, obviously, the perfect scenario is that the other person comes to that conversation with that area in mind and mentions it, in which case, of course, that statement there is redundant. But assuming you have to mention it, you would then stop as the leader and say, what's your opinion about that or this? So in other words, you give the other person an opportunity to talk and to elaborate. And remember, these are conversations, so the whole purpose of this is that it's not one way. This is a two-way dialogue, so that the other person in the conversation be given that space to elaborate on their opinion. And then another question that might follow from that is, what are the behaviours you believe you are doing, or in some cases not doing, that are leading to this area for improvement? So in other words, you're just teasing out some of the fundamentals around what people are doing or not doing in relation to that area. So those last 3 questions may not need to be asked, but they're there just in case, and that's why I put them there, because obviously you're in a situation there where you may need to raise other things if you do have an improvement area on your mind and it hasn't been broached. You can certainly discuss that at that stage. So that's essentially what we're trying to do there. So hopefully that's clear. If you've got any questions, now's the time to type them in, and I'm more than happy to deal with them. So I don't see any questions, so that's fine. It sounds like everyone's happy with that, those questions. Okay. And I should point out to you at this stage, and I'll sort of allude to this a bit more in the next slide, is that really there's no problem with agreeing to disagree. This is not supposed to be some confrontation. Ideally, these areas for improvement have already been discussed, but the whole purpose of this conversation is to put on the table some areas. We've all got areas to work on, And this is not any great criticism of anybody. The truth of the matter is we've all got things that we need to work on. Whether we're aware of those things or not is another matter, but we've all got them. And what this conversation's trying to do is to unearth what those areas might look like. So that's why we want you, when you come to this conversation, to be prepared to share with your team leader or manager your areas for improvement, in particular 1 or 2 at the most. All right, just a couple of tips and hints to finish up on to improve the quality of these conversations. So and I call you the coachee if you're on the receiving end, as I indicated earlier, come to the conversation prepared, having thought about it. Take the initiative and book the conversation. If you find that your leader's busy or hasn't got around to booking a time with you, do it straight away. It would be ideal if you could do that this week, or if you're around next week, and to finish it before the end of the year, and it's done and dusted, and we can then start talking about conversation 4 in the new year. Be constructive and open-minded. So easier said than done, I must admit, but the whole point of this is supposed to be an open dialogue and an authentic conversation between you and your boss. So the whole idea is to be constructive and open-minded about it. It's not a forum for criticism. It's not supposed to be something where you can dump on your leader. And as I said earlier, if you are the person on the receiving end of this conversation, don't be afraid to agree to disagree, because the fact that you have agreed to disagree means that it's clear that that is the case. If you say nothing, then what happens, of course, is that there is an assumption on the part of the leader that you actually agree with the feedback or the comment. So just be prepared to speak your mind about that. And remember, as I said earlier, this is not a transactional performance review. This is not about evaluating your performance and giving you a score. It's essentially a conversation between you and your team leader and manager, and it's done on equal terms. Now, it's interesting yesterday that we had some people talking about some people meet away from the office, and they have indicated to me that they get great results out of that. If you haven't done that, you might want to try that. It's just good to get away from the office and go and perhaps have a coffee and have that conversation somewhere else. I also heard someone yesterday say that they had their conversation while they were walking around the botanical gardens. Sounds good to me. He claimed that that worked for him very well, and so you don't need to be confined to your office, and you don't need to book a room necessarily, but there's no reason you can certainly do that. But I'm just suggesting to you that these conversations can go on anywhere. They don't necessarily have to be in your working area. Now, if you're the coach, in which case you'd be the person, the team leader or the manager, here's a couple of tips for you that I think will help you in your preparation for this conversation. Obviously, it's a good idea to just go back over the questions that I've just ran through with you so that you are aware of what the flow of the conversation is. You've only got to remember a couple of key questions, so it's not difficult, and that's why it's designed that way, because we don't want people to be taking notes, copious notes or anything like that. In fact, no notes need to be taken. This should just be a relaxed conversation between two people. If you're the coach, you can take the responsibility for booking the time and the place, making sure that the other person's available at that time. So out of courtesy, make sure that the other person can make that conversation, because there's nothing more frustrating than having to rebook the conversation because the person had to cancel because they had a major project they were working on at the time. And we're all busy, so just be smart about how you do it. As I said earlier, it might be an idea that if you've been meeting in the office, why don't you try meeting off-site for a change? See what that happens, see if that has any impact in terms of the quality of the conversation. Refer to the questions, but don't read them off. I mentioned that earlier. Be patient. Allow the other person to elaborate on their responses. We all know some people are quiet, some people are not, but just be patient and allow that person to comment. And be respectfully curious. It's a nice phrase, respectfully curious. Ask questions like why? Why did you say that? What? What did you mean? Where? Where does it take place? Who? Who are you referring to? How? How do you mean? And which particular project are you referring to? So the whole idea is to allow the other person to elaborate. The goal for you as the leader is to make sure that there's 50% talking and 50% listening. So the whole idea is to allow the other person to elaborate. They must feel heard, and sometimes but you need to prompt people by asking questions to draw them out, and that becomes really, really important. So guys, that's pretty much it for me today. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to deal with them now. But other than that, we're pretty much done. So any questions? Okay. Well, I'd like to wish you all a nice, relaxing, safe, festive season. I wish you all the very best for 2018. I've really enjoyed working with you, and I want to see this continue. So persevere. You obviously can build a good skill set up here as well around, if you're a leader, around conducting conversations, and of course if you're the person on the receiving end, you're building up some skill sets and hopefully a little bit more trust with your team leader or manager. So I'll sign off here and thank you very much for your involvement.